Interestingly enough, yesterday I was at the place that kind of acted as a catalyst for my involvement in this space, the Tate Gallery. I grew up as a kid round the corner from the Tate. And so I went there kind of regularly, routinely, in fact. Every Saturday or so, I would go to the Tate. And I think it was both the place I discovered the beauty and the joy of form, as well as the ambition to make something. Because inevitably what happens, and I suspect this is true for all artists, you start admiring something and the admiration becomes so intense that it functions as a kind of critique for you. In other words, the admiration becomes a lens through which you see the flaws or the incomplete in something. So for instance, if you're a 12-year-old and you're black in 1970 something and you go into the Tate every Saturday or so, it doesn't take long, providing you're perceptive, and I was, and providing you love art, which I did, it doesn't take long for you to then realize there are not many people who look like you in the paintings that you're watching, that you love. So it's not that you fall out of love with the stuff, you just use that love as the basis for your own ambitions. You go, okay, when I grow up, I'm going to do this. So you still love the works that you're not in. It's just that they become ammunition. They become fuel for your own work. So that's where it started. I started being in love with art from the 19th century largely, and ended up wanting to be an artist myself. As I said, I don't think this is untypical, actually. I think most artists that I've met, they wouldn't necessarily put it in those terms, but that's kind of how it starts, The mystery for me is why I wanted to work in moving image. Because that came later. My love affair with the moving image came later. It was also to do with another institution close to where I lived. I lived in West London, or Southwest London, and around the corner from my house was an independent cinema called the Paris Pullman. A rep cinema which showed films on a kind of rota. So you went in on Monday and you could see a Hollywood film from the 40s, and then you went on Tuesday, you saw an Italian neorealist film, that kind of thing. And I loved it. But love for cinema was a slightly different proposition, because I realized that being in a cinema was one of the few places where you were undisturbed. And when you're a young black kid in the 70s, there was a lot of disturbing. So the cinema was actually one of those public spaces where you found intimacy, where you could kind of be free and in communion with something else other than yourself, And for a weird kind of osmosis, or somehow through this weird osmosis, at some point in the 70s, I thought, actually, these two things are the same. I'm going to do something that's influenced by these two in some ways. Origins of any project are always kind of slightly complicated, but this one's slightly easier to describe than most. So, at some point before the pandemic, I think a year and a half before the pandemic, I came to Plymouth to meet the then director to talk about the anniversary for, the Pilgrim landings or the Pilgrim journeys. And we were going to do a film, a multi-screen piece for The Box. The Box is opening. And somewhere along the line, we had done most of the research already. We'd gone to North America, found the places we were going to film. We decided on Vancouver Island as our main spot, but we were going to go to Washington, all over the place. All set. came back from the last recce in the week that Britain closed its doors because of the pandemic, because of COVID. So for 3 years, we pretty much didn't do anything. But the 3 years allowed the possibility of a rethink, and the reason for that is worth explaining. At the heart of the Pilgrim Journey project was a mystery and an enigma that I hadn't quite figured out, right? And that was to do with the fact that when the pilgrims arrived, essentially the place they arrived at was empty, right? And one of the things that you first encounter in all the narratives about the arrival is, when they got there was no one, which meant that it was unpopulated, so they could take it as a place to live. It wasn't really until halfway through the pandemic that the significance of that started to dawn on us. And the reason for the depopulated spaces that they encountered, as indeed is the case with most depopulated spaces, they're not natural. They're usually like that because someone's dead. And so the pilgrims encountered this depopulated space because the earlier waves of European arrival had brought with them a cocktail of viruses and diseases which had wiped out, the First Nation peoples who had no immunity to these viruses, smallpox in particular. And to make this recognition in the middle of a pandemic then started to change how we conceived of the project, because at that point I then thought, okay, well, why don't we then, rather than doing the pilgrims, why don't we just backtrack a bit here? Why don't we just go back and see whether, like in the way in which films why don't we rewind history here a bit, and do the period before the arrival of the pilgrims, so that we can explain to both ourselves and the people interested in our project why this place was empty. So that, in a nutshell, is the intellectual and ethical genesis of Arcadia. I started to realize that you could actually make a project in which, irrespective of the ambitions of people, other forces, other agencies, other actors play significant roles in the drama that's about to unfold, right? So the settling of the New World is always told as a kind of human drama. The Conquistador, Filippo, blah, 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 all the names that everyone knows. And that's all true. But actually, a significant part is played by non-human actors in this drama, right? The vast majority of Inca, Mayan, Aztec peoples, 3/4 of them at least, died, not through any encounter with swords or battle, but through just being exposed to smallpox. 3/4. Whole nations just disappeared as a result of this. So that's the impetus behind Arcadia. It was an attempt to try and see how, before the guns came out, what other weapons, what other forms of biological warfare, intended or otherwise, usually unintended, took place in the New World. In the case of Arcadia, the key theme, which has now become the subject of a kind of trilogy, if you will, is the role that wind plays in the drama of human affairs, right? Because, of course, the discovery of the trade wind that led from one side of the Atlantic to the other was a game changer. The realization that you could literally sail from the coast of Africa, which the Portuguese discovered sitting in Africa. And we're like, whoa, wow, we could do this. You can go from one side of the world to the other. That's a game changer. And so irrespective of what Columbus or Diaz or any of these people wanted, the big player is the wind in this drama. That's the player, right? And it felt important to do something which had that player as a key actor. Right? When they arrive, the wind also plays like a major role in this, because of course all of these viruses are wind-borne. Right? So you could be a Mayan civility sitting on top of it with very little contact with conquistadors or Portuguese sailors, but the wind brought this to you. Yeah. So the wind is a major player in this. I mean, in a way, this is something I've been involved with a lot, trying to make projects in which questions of the human, the environmental, the historical and the archival play some sort of ensemble role in which each is a sort of significant actor. So in many ways, Arcadia is a kind of continuation of the sort of work that we've been doing with Vertigo C and Purple. But it does have this historical setting. It is based in the New World. It's about the formation of the New World, and it's about the factors, biological, environmental, as well as historical, that led to the creation of the New World. So that in a not so nutshell is Arcadia. I'm always interested in using music, but there seemed to me to be something particularly operatic about the colonial gesture, right? In other words, there's a sort of cast of players, and they perform a drama of conquest, expansion, and extraction. You arrive and you say, I am Pizarro or Philippe. This is me. It's all bold, graphic gestures, and it kind of reminded me of opera in a way. And it just so happens that there is an opera exactly about the conquest of the New World, called The African. It's a 19th century opera, and that's what you hear, right, throughout. And the arias, exactly what you'd expect an opera about colonial conquest to be. It's, oh, paradise, I'm so happy to be here. Claim me, make my life what it should be. Blah, blah, blah. So the musical in this instance is one more archival fragment that we can use, over and above the costumes and the paraphernalia of conflict, the swords, etc., etc. That's, the opera is just one more layer of these. The research, as usual, for this went all over the place, because Lena Gopal, who produces these projects with David Lawson and Ashti Akamfra, were convinced that there were layers of hidden material that we hadn't seen before. And of course that turned out to be the case. And all these fantastic codexes, sometimes constructed as narratives from the inside. So, Aztec figures who learned Spanish writing about the experience of their annihilation, or trying to explain to the outside their deities, their gods, their rituals, and so on, before they all disappear. Because you've got to remember, these are, this is like living the experience of a plague in which people are just dying everywhere, and one isn't exactly sure whether one would survive, right? So these are plague journals, being put together by people who were on the verge of extinction, quite literally. So many of these records are are in there, and I'm interested in them in the same way that I've always been in peoples without monuments, because the archival traces is really all that's left of many of these communities. You look at drawings made by Aztec craftsmen from the 1630s and 40s, and they may well be some of the last people left of their clan, their hamlet, their village. I mean, look, I've worked with triptychs. I've done most of the work, multi-screen work in triptychs, and so it didn't feel like a huge leap of faith, shall we say, to start working with the crucifix form. But actually, the reasons for that are not symbolic at all. It started off as an attempt to. When you see the end, all of this will make sense, because visually there are certain clues at the end about the globality of this event that felt only possible to capture in that shape, because I'd worked with triptychs a lot, where you've got 3 screens having conversations with each other. And it seemed to me that we needed to add something to the triptych form, because the triptych is a very dialectical form. Yes, no, okay. Yes, I say this, you say that. We join it together. We say the third thing in the middle. But this felt like you needed a more dialogic structure. You needed something more expansive than that. Yeah, I wanted something beyond dialectical, something which is in the yin yang and in the middle, something more kind of discursive, if you will. Now, the fact that it's also the most potent symbol of colonial conquest made it an appropriate structure to use. But I never use anything just for a symbolic value. Everything has to have some root in the practicality of trying to do something, trying to make something work. And if you look at the earlier work, you can see what thoughts might go through my head. So I'm making this thing, and I'm thinking, okay, I made something about whaling and the history of whaling, and that was a triptych form. And that worked because you're talking sea, people, other species. So somehow the triptych gave them, this is slightly different, because I've got all 3, but then I've got 3 other layers. I've got viruses who are other so I just needed more screens to allocate to the new actors who are coming on board for this project. And it felt the crucifix structure, i.e. 5 screens in conversation with each other, felt like the best way to go with it. On a very serious level, I love Plymouth. I like it as a space. But beyond that, it seems to me that what happens in time is that places go through phases. Lisbon in Portugal was like a big city in the 15th, 16th century. It's not anymore. It doesn't mean that it's necessarily a bad place, but it's just not as powerful as it used to be. And I think in this country, the equivalent of Lisbon will be Plymouth, right? This is one of those epicenters of the colonial adventure. Many, many, many of the key players in this drama, from the Hawkinses to the Drakes to the Raleighs, came from there. So Plymouth is a kind of New York, if you will, of the 16th century. It's a big place, big reputations, big industries that changed and defined the world. One can't, in fact, do the story of the New World without including Plymouth in some way. in many ways, Arcadia is a kind of continuation of the project that we started in Plymouth in 2015, the Tropicus project. Because many of the ships, quite literally, many of the ships that ended up in the New World, possibly even some of the ones with, Portuguese and Spanish owners, would have started their life in Plymouth. Plymouth is a player in this. So that's the reason why I came. But I'm also interested in trying to decenter the practice a little bit, trying to involve other spaces other than the main metropolitan ones, the Londons and that, because it's usually referencing histories, stories from this place. We're talking about a project in which quite literally many people who live in Plymouth have direct biological relations with some of the figures we're making this project about. You get a big boat that leaves Plymouth in 1540 to go to the Guinea coast. And it has one of the Hawkinses as a captain. Well, it took sailors and cooks and from Plymouth. And those families are still there. Some of the figures from there have descendants who still live. So it's in many ways a Plymouth story. And it felt necessary to restage it in Plymouth. And people say to me, well, a lot of your work's about migration and the archive, isn't it? And I say yes. But I think they assume that usually means that it's about migration of people of color, right? Or the archive of people of color, right? In this particular instance, yes, I am very interested in migration. But it's, of course, the migrant tale from Europe, right? These are migrations because, of course, very, very many of the people who ended up in the New World from Europe never came back. They settled there and had kids and, married, And so the New World is quite literally the product of these migrations, but going the other way. And it's important to say this because oftentimes the language of migration is seen as a kind of racial language, or the language of people from the global south. And we forget very easily that actually in the last 500 years, there's been colossal movements. They're not just one way, right? We only have Australia and North America, all of these places because Europeans moved in their millions the other way, and the archival traces of those migrations, because I'm interested in archives, as you say, is exactly the stuff we're working with. It's not just the official records, but the drawings, the books, the oral testimonies recorded in manuscript form, the ruins left, all of that is the archival trace of that history of migration. I'm interested in migration very, very much, but I'm interested in the manifold narratives of migration because it's through migration that the modern world came about. How do I develop ideas? Well, I always say this to people. The practice is very research-based. We spend more time researching, finding stuff, looking for stuff than we do making anything. So much so that you have to say that the research is, the most important part of the making of stuff. I can't tell you how many times this happens. Because I don't have an idea that's fully formed that I then go and put into practice. Not once. I've never had one. I've never had an idea at the beginning of a project that remained the same by the end. It just doesn't happen because there's the magic of discovery, the magic of the accidental detour, the magic of the mistake, all of that accrues to the point where it becomes, the practice itself. So it doesn't matter whether it's a book that you look at or a location. Sometimes you stand in a place, you look around, you think, okay, we can do this here. And that single decision has this kind of butterfly effect, chain reaction effect across the whole project, right? So Arcadia, I had the idea that we might have figures in uniforms with the most anonymous, most, stuff not trying to be historical at all, just anonymous. And we started working, and I realized that our key designer would turn up in one of the anonymous light uniforms. And so I said to him once, stand there and let's do something with you. And from that began the key figure. The key figure in the project was not one that I had set off to work with at all. That's a real figure. That's his own costume. But at some point, he just became a kind of indispensable figure in the drama. I mean, the accidental, the chance encounter with the unknown is what projects are about. You need to obviously do a lot of work in preparing to jump. But you need to be prepared when you land after the jump into a new space, into the unknown. And you need to be prepared to let the unknown inhabit the already defined ideas, almost pasteurizing it, tilling it, making it, in organicist terms, making it grow, and without that, nothing actually happens. There's something deadening about the certainty of things, knowing what things are going to be like in the beginning, regurgitating them in the middle, and ending up with that at the end. It's just, there's no point. Just leave it as a book or a song or whatever it is. And there's no point. In order for it to pass through something called the creative process, whatever that means. Well, not whatever that means. What it means for me, the creative process, is the possibility of transformation. So that something enters into a space of certainty, it engenders a certain kind of uncertainty. You think, oh, okay, let me think about this now. Oh, okay. Because the uncertainty is just the remnant of a new suggestion, a new possibility. That's all it is. It's like, okay, this is now uncertain because something else is suggesting itself. And the thing is to be relaxed, to not panic, and invite the voice of the uncertain to speak. And they usually, something emerges. If you're patient enough and if you don't panic, I did 3 months of this and now it's all falling down. No. If you don't do that, then something will come in, usually. Yeah, trust. I like fidelity to things. I like to be faithful to things. But there's a certain point when it becomes foolhardy to be over-attached to the old. Because unless you let it go, the new can't come. And literally, time-based work is about that. It's about the unfolding of time. And the cycle is that there is certainty and at some point uncertainty, which then becomes a certain, it's like a clock. That's one of the reasons I love clocks as well. It's not so much that they tell you the time, but they're also signals of uncertainty. Because in between the seconds, that time, what is it? In between the arrivals, there's always a gap. And the gap is as important as the place you've left and where you're going to go to, because the gap is what signals the arrival of the new. So I'm very attached to transformations in projects. It's the most important bit for me. One of the reasons why the clocks are particularly important with this project is that the New World project was in fact about new definitions of time. So you're going to Peru and you're saying to a community, yeah, you know what, you guys, you get up in the morning and you go and till your little farm, and we're not going to do that anymore. What we're going to do is, when you get up, you come here and then you do 4 hours. Oh, you don't know what 4 hours is? It's when you go from there. Right? So it's about regulating people's behavior, their attitudes, their sense of their life, their sense of their futures, so that you can make it fit this thing that we've now got, the modern world. 8-hour days, 24 hours, and blah, 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 blah. That's, everything is apportioned certain spaces. Without, we haven't always lived like that as human beings. And this was the beginning of it, of modern temporality, basically. That's why the clocks are important. So I like objects and things that are not just symbols or metaphors, but metonyms, the thing itself. I'm not trying to say, oh, this looks like time. No, this is time. It's a clock. It's about time. That's it. It's not trying to say it's about time. It is time. I like that. I like the banality of stating the obvious, because sometimes that has a brutal poetry to it. I've been asked quite a few times what Arcadia, the title, refers to and what it means. Now, Arcadia is a little bit like Utopia. They're not the same. It's a bit like Utopia in the sense that it's one of those words which has been with us for a very long time, and so it refers to a lot. In this particular instance, there's a certain ironic detachment to the phrase, right? But it's not completely ironic, because the reason why the New World is called a New World is not a pejorative. I didn't make it up. I think somewhere in the European imagination was the sense of the elsewhere that the New World was, as a place of refresh, restart, new beginnings, because in fact that's what the Pilgrims left for a new beginning. And in this fantasy of a new start and a new beginning lies an idea that's been with us since the Greeks, really, which is that there is always a place over there, somewhere, where we can be ourselves, where we can be free, quote unquote. The problem a lot of the times is that Arcadia has a downside. So somebody's free world is always somebody's hell. So that's why I say we use it with a certain ironic detachment. But it is nevertheless rooted in the reality. There are certain Arcadian yearnings, if you like, behind the impulse to make it to the New World. It's not all cynical. It's not all, we'll get there and exterminate another tribe. No, I think there's a genuine desire to do something heroic, to do something Promethean, something Herculean. And many, many, many unintended consequences usually come attached to gestures of that kind. So you may well want to create heaven, but it is possible that in the process of trying to, very good-naturedly do this, you end up with something else. I'm not saying that all of it was good-natured, for sure it wasn't, but not necessarily everything terrible that happened with the exterminations was intended. And that's why it's important to have this organicist vision of these adventures, because we are not the only actors. One of the things that we wanted this project to be about was what the biohistorians call the Columbian Exchange, right? And the Columbian Exchange is this process by which, in the process of traveling to one place, i.e. Europeans moving from the old world, quote unquote, to the new world, they take with them certain things, literally take with them. They are carriers, harbingers of things. You know, Christianity for one is one, you know, so it's not all terrible stuff, but there was also other carriers, you know, viruses, rats, you know, which then wreak havoc on that place. But in the process of exporting this, other things are also imported, some intended, some unintended, you know. One of the unintended, obviously, a kind of expanded vision of the universe and the world. You suddenly discover others, you know, other creatures, other sentient beings, and so on. But there's stuff that you also then bring with you that you want: fruit, raw materials, foodstuffs, etc., etc. So that's the Columbian Exchange. It's this sort of mode of circularity in which, you know, the act of travel elsewhere ends up depositing things there, which then start to make an impact on that place. But in the process, you also export or import rather stuff back that also then has an impact here. You know, so much of our food, as you know, came from elsewhere. Without those journeys, the potatoes and most of the fruit and all of that would just not be around.